Everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm pretty excited to bring something to your guys' awareness that goes against the grain of what we understand when it comes to emotions and our actual state of being. I think it becomes increasingly obvious to most of us that are living this world today that we are bound, seemingly bound, that is, to forces that are outside of ourselves when it comes to being able to affect our affect as a human being and as part of the human condition. How we find ourselves in today's world and how we emotionally regulate or maintain, a level of sanity in today's world, just given what's going on in the news and all of this background noise around us, etc. Now, it's been written, I think, at least if not written, it's just common understanding. And from the view of psychology and science, that there are such things as generalized anxiety disorders and anxiety in general, and how we see anxiety as kind of like a disease, right? A disease state, especially if we're living in a heightened level of anxiety, and how that manifests in each individual varies, right? There are some people that are very good at hiding their anxiety, and there are some people that are seemingly helpless being able to control their anxiety states. That extends to agoraphobia, fear of going outside, um, etc. So, what I'm bringing to you here today is this is one of my videos I'm putting out that's multifaceted. My multifaceted videos are really trying to get the audience, you guys, to understand fundamental truth regardless of perspective, right? As I've said before, there are two sides to every coin. In some cases, there's more than two sides. Sometimes it can be multifaceted. Multifaceted in a way that we can use interpretations to explain the same thing from different angles, but each prevailing view has a different explanation as to why. So today I'm going to be talking about anxiety. I would say collectively for me, throughout my life, there have been situations where I have been very resilient to anxiety, and then other times where I've succumbed more to it. I definitely wouldn't say I have overarching generalized anxiety disorder. A lot of what breeds anxiety in a lot of us actually is whether or not we feel safe. Safety even before happiness, right? Whether or not we feel physically safe, financially safe, whether we feel mentally safe around the people we surround ourselves with. And with that, the opposite of insecurity would be, feeling empowered, right? Feeling like we have the tools, the kit, the resources to be able to manage our variable outside environment, right? We would all agree that we're not directly responsible for our outside environment. Certainly, we all have unwittingly a choice in life about whether or not we're going to contribute towards making the outside world, the world outside of us, more anxious or less anxious. And I think for some of us as well, it can start to feel after a while like we're gaslighting ourselves. If we try to push ourselves into believing something positive, especially if there's been a chronic stressor in the works, especially in situations where there's just uncertainty about a given outcome in our future, whether it be searching for work, or something more ominous than that, but whatever the challenge that lies ahead for us, that there's uncertainty. Now, up until present, as I was alluding to a few minutes ago, science and psychology would want to treat anxiety like a medical condition, and that, as they say, there's PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, or there's chronic PTSD, or there's anxiety, or there's chronic anxiety. Now, what's really interesting is there's a person by the name of Lisa Feldman Barrett, who has spent considerable amount of time, basically her entire career, studying anxiety and studying of the human emotions when it relates to anxiety. Now, what's really foundational and what I think is really important, and I feel like I want to put out like a long form, really well polished video to discuss this topic because I think it's just so universal in the current zeitgeist we find ourselves in the current modern day moment, that we feel like we want to have more semblance of control over and to feel empowered where perhaps we're not typically feeling as empowered. Now, the advice I'm wanting to offer and the recommendations I'm wanting to offer by adopting her views on this, I don't want you to adopt it simply to gaslight yourself. That's not the intent. If you're not convinced, then it's not helpful. But I think you'll find that the reason why the videos I put out, whether or not they resonate or not with people, is one, comes down to exposure, how many people actually see the video, which then, and two, feeds the algorithm, and whether or not it's a topic that's resonating with people, right? Whether the topic I choose is one that people are looking for, someone to talk about said topic, but more importantly, how it deeply resonates. The way that we build connection in today's world is by taking the time to take our personal experiences, bring them to the surface, and share them with one another in a way that makes each of us feel connected and less out of sorts, crazy, when it comes to the state of the world and factors that are outside of ourselves that we're seemingly unable to control. And I think we'd all agree that we live in a very unjust world nowadays. And so that makes the challenge all the more daunting. Now, having said that, let me get to the point. So what Lisa put forward is that when it comes to emotions, when it comes to human emotions, and I know that she's right when she says this, these emotions, even if they are built in a place of childhood, in a place of developmentally established emotional patterns that are unsafe, obviously people that are younger that had to experience those kinds of traumas versus someone that had parents that really made them feel seen, heard, and validated. I do think there's a fundamental difference, but I think she even argues that basically inherently emotions are not built into us. They're not built into us. They're not truly a part of us. Why? Because as humans, and if we go back to fundamental biology when it comes to the brain, and I think it's important to separate ourselves a little bit from that because I know there's this dichotomous view of, is it the mind or is it the body, right? But for a moment, separating the two out, let's just focus on the mind, not so much the body. Now we'll come back to the mind here in a second because the body can inform the mind, right? If the body's hurting or the body doesn't feel safe, body's under stress, of course, it's going to have an effect on the mind and vice versa. But for a moment, let's just focus on this. So when we are looking towards the future, or we're even looking towards the past, what do we know? We know that when we experience things in life, adverse situations, because of learning and memory, our brain chooses to adapt said information, which may be useful or not useful. Take for a moment another example. So guys have all seen those posters or pictures before of 3D objects within space. One of my favorite is of the dinosaur. That's like a pop-up dinosaur that's made out of basically cardboard. And because of the way it incorporates an angle, when you turn your head around this object, it looks like the dinosaur's following you. And I've also seen ones that are, you can get like some hypercubes or some cubes that you can put in the corner and it makes it pop, right? So it's superimposing 2D printed on a 3D space. And by adding that, parallax effect, so to speak, it really causes the cube or the dinosaur to pop. And moreover, the specific object, even though its print isn't changing, it's static, from the way the brain interprets that space ultimately lies to us about what it is. So you understand that the brain inherently tries to seek the most efficient ways to do things. And that's in part where habituation comes from, right? When we start out and we are learning something new, until we get used to said thing, and it takes a long time, we feel really uncomfortable with it. Hence why it's difficult to develop new skills, new habits, or even to become great at something. We all are familiar with the phrase, practice makes perfect, right? That phrase holds fundamental truth, no doubt, holds deep fundamental truth. So with that, take for a moment. Okay, so through learning and memory, let's say that you've had bad experiences before with employers, or bad experience before with family or friends or colleagues or what have you, external factors, right? And let's say that you say, for instance, you haven't dated in a while. What if you had previously had a relationship that was extremely traumatic, that coming into this next relationship, you're going to find it very difficult to trust, right? Where does that come from? It comes from a past experience. That past experience colors the future experience, right? Well, if we think here for just a moment, what we do know is we know that what our brains ultimately are doing is they're telling a narrative to ourselves about the future. Could be of the past, but let's just focus on the future at the current moment. That something bad's going to happen because something bad happened before. That's what the narrative in our head is rolling constantly, right? And it's a survival mechanism. Not that it's a bad survival mechanism, but ultimately biology, when it comes to our brain and the lower brain centers, are going to hijack at the area of the amygdala, et cetera, to say that there is a danger. So as you know, the most truest sense of living is in the present moment, irrespective of the past, irrespective of the future, to let everything else go and to live in the moment, and then to check in, to bring your mind back to the body, right? And recognize that you're safe. Now, the other flavor to this is that if you carry trauma in your body, say you're missing a body part, say that you've underwent physical trauma, then of course the body can cause the mind to go into fight or flight, right? So what she's basically saying here is that since our brains are prediction machines, which they are, we are inherently, with the way that we think, constantly predicting what's going to happen next. So we can then, in turn, react to said situation. The problem, though, and as I said time and time again, is I may not have control over what happens to me, but I do have control over the way I react to it. And number one. And number two, focusing on things in a perpetual way when you don't have any additional information left to our own devices, perhaps our own vices here, we will then... of mentality, that is, we will then tell stories to ourselves that may not be true or fundamentally true at all, right? Like, for instance, dealing with two separate individual people and expecting the same exact outcome, whether that's a future job from a past bad experience with a job, or a future relationship given a past bad experience with a past relationship. We read too much into it, right? Potentially. Not always, but potentially. So what we need to then understand fundamentally is, since our brains are basically prediction machines, and again, this is to save energy, this is to keep us safe, our brain and our imagination will run amok. And so what we need to then recognize from that is to detach from the thought, because that's all they are, is thoughts. Feelings and thoughts are not us. They're responses to the environment. And when we let that experience resonate so deeply with us for too long, what ends up happening is it becomes dysregulated. But going back to her point, they're not built into us. So like in developmental psychology, certainly if you've had traumatic experience as a kid, it'll color your experience for the rest of your life, potentially, right? But what's empowering, and you may call BS on this, but I don't call BS on this, we actually have the ability to understand that the fundamental underlying mechanism that's at work here is our brain trying to make sense of something that maybe A, isn't supposed to be made sense of. And certainly if you're a person of faith, you could support that thought. And B, that predictions are not actual reality. Going back a moment to that perspective bit, with the 3D objects in space and how our eyes and our brain fills in the gaps with things. So essentially, what's important to understand is that when it comes to emotions, again, are the reaction to the future or reactions to the past, right? So it's a feed forward mechanism where we're trying to predict what's happening next in the future. And in the past, it's learning and memory, right? And both kind of inform one another. So if you bring yourself to the present moment of just watching this video for a moment, you will understand, regardless of your circumstances, you're breathing, you are safe. I hope you're safe. If you're not, you need to get somewhere that's safe. You are safe. Bring yourself back into the body. Clear your mind of all thought. Recognize for a moment that you are not the emotion. You are not the reaction. All your brain and body, as you feel the stress in your body, is trying to do is to try to keep you safe. This was very helpful in the hunter-gatherer days, in the days that we were constantly up against stresses. But fundamentally, in today's world, in the domesticated world, it's not so helpful. As I mentioned before, Peter Levine's Waking the Tiger talks about somatic psychology. And if you're not at all familiar with what somatic psychology is, it's basically the psychology associated with our mind's connection with the body. So the brain and body connection. Why is that important? Because in certain dysregulated senses, our brain can interpret emotional pain as physical pain, or physical pain becomes then emotional pain, right? The two can kind of go hand in hand. But fundamentally, what we're really ultimately looking at here is that when you recognize for a moment that the body and mind are one, we always want to dichotomize. One's over here and one's on the other side, but they're connected, right? It's more of a spectrum than it is two independent points. And given that for a moment, going back to somatic psychology specifically in Waking the Tiger, that specific book, what it's discussing that animals in nature do not hold on to the traumas like we do as humans. Why? Because of societal expectations, right? One thing I want to just diverge into really quickly is how we're spending our time nowadays is also not helpful. Our attention span and seeking outward answers to inward problems to try to, get people to calm us is sometimes not the most helpful. It's the same reason why I really feel a deep fear for the younger generations that have not had to walk the path of self-discovery and the rite of passage that all adults have to experience when it comes to finding validation within oneself rather than seeking outward validation to achieve it. Ultimately, we should all be aiming for authenticity, creativity rather than just consumption, doing something creative on our own, and not placing qualifiers on it. That's the other part about all this, is that I know for a lot of us, it's very difficult for us to get into the creative space unless we feel safe ourselves. And if we're focused on short form content or what's going on in the political space or just the world at large, with how negative everything is, we can become lost in the sea of thoughts and ideas and events outside of ourselves that then rewrites the narrative for what's inside of us. What I also think is important is being in the present moment, the present. They call it a present for a reason. The present moment, which is a present, which is a gift given to you, allows you to connect with source, allows you to connect with yourselves. Now, I will say, I'm not a guru when it comes to meditation. I think meditation is very difficult to achieve in today's world, or to spend time alone in the moment, not doing anything at all, not being on your phone, nothing. It can seem like it's a waste of time when in American culture, it tells us to go, especially if there's something on our list that we're attempting to achieve and we're not able to achieve it. And today's world also commands of us that we do better than we did yesterday and the day before and the day before in an unsustainable way that's very akin to the way capitalism runs businesses, right? Which is to hollow it the heck out, let alone what we see, what this culture has done to companies or what it even does to people in general. It can bring out the worst in people. We should all be led to lead with love and light and compassion and care. And I can respect, I know for myself, it's sometimes hard when you've been so abused and misused by people to be able to put forth that love and compassion and that kindness, when it's just take, take, take. But the thing that I encourage you to do is definitely start trying to get into your creative space. Try to not romanticize your pain or romanticize the moment necessarily, or I guess the pain element, but yeah, try to romanticize your own life and make yourself the main character for a moment, that you're not the person that's out of control, floating on this rock with all of these things happening. We live in a 24-hour news cycle, right? So now drawing that back to the emotions for a minute, recognize that you are not your emotions. You're not even your feelings. Fundamentally, at its core, if we try to take on the identity of those things that are outside of us, it'll not only make us more confused and more anxious, but ultimately will lead us astray for the thing that we're searching so desperately for, especially if we're as thought leaders wanting to lead in this world. So recognize for a moment that you are not your emotions. Your emotions are simply a prediction machine about what's going to happen next. And that narration is not always correct. There's also a thing called confirmation bias, right? So we need to understand that our framing and view of the world shapes the next view. And it's also the reason why it's also written in the Bible, talking about be careful what you say and what you think. It's also talked about in Eastern philosophies as well. But it's also talked about in law of manifestation and law of attraction. So we have to be careful with how we're spending our time and what we're exposing ourselves to. We may think it doesn't matter, but it does make an impact on our lives. So to turn that around, I would recommend that you start by watching that TED Talk by, like I said, Lisa Feldman Barrett on YouTube. And I'll put out a commentary video, like an actual polished piece here in a bit to really make the full impact of what I'm saying. But in the meantime, I wish you all wellness. Be well. Love and light to you all. Until next time.